uh, don't look at human examples and try to derive morality from that. Instead, the thing to do is look at the concept of a rational being, which Kant thinks is essentially connected to the concept of moral action and action done out of duty. Look at that concept and derive morality from that. That's how you're supposed to derive morality, out of reason itself, and not, from the senses, which is what Kant doesn't want you to do. Okay, so let's embark on this big project. Let's figure out how we're going to derive moral concepts from the concept of a rational being as such. Okay, so one thing that Kant says, this is also on page 412, but this is on page 80 of our book. Everything in nature works in accordance with laws. This is his section beginning imperatives in general, and this is going to take us into his ideas of what imperatives are. He says, only a rational being has the power to act in accordance with his idea of laws. So, this sets up a certain contrast between things in nature and rational beings. So I have some dental floss here. I'm going to drop this object. It operates in accordance with laws. The laws of nature say, well, when something is dropped close to, Earth, close to a large massive body, gravity is going to operate on it and pull it towards that body. Okay, that operates in accordance with laws. I guess it's not really a natural object since floss is kind of a man-made thing, but that's not important here. If I could have pulled some kind of object from outside and dropped it, it would have worked the same. Anyway, these physical objects, just random objects in the world that are not rational beings, operate in accordance with natural laws. Now, rational beings like you and me, they also operate in accordance with these physical laws, but there's something special about what they can do in addition. I operate in accordance with physical laws. I can't, break laws of nature by flying around the room or something like that. But there's something else I can do. I don't just follow laws of nature. I'm capable, Kant thinks, of also being able to operate under my idea of laws. I can take something into my head as a law that I ought to follow, as a law that, as a rational being, I should follow, and operate according to that. And that's something special about us. That's how human beings differ from ordinary objects in the world. We are capable of freely accepting something as a law that we ought to follow and following it. This goes back to, if you remember from the preface at the very beginning of Kant's groundwork. He says, ancient Greek philosophy was divided into three sciences: physics, ethics, and logic. And he says that physics and ethics are separated because the laws of physics are the laws of nature. All the laws of ethics are the laws of freedom. And that's, the interesting distinction that's coming up here too. This object, follows laws of nature. In deciding that I should drop this object to give you an example, I am deciding that I should give you an example and thinking, that's what I ought to do as a rational being trying to illustrate things in Kant and make mildly amusing things happen on YouTube for the enjoyment of students watching. I don't know if I created much enjoyment. I probably didn't. Anyway, well, I think I ought to do that. And I act in accordance with that idea of what I ought to do. As a rational being, I'm capable of that. This object, this container of floss, is not capable of doing that. And that's, essential to my being a rational being, and it's not. Okay. So that's something that's special about rational beings. They can operate in accordance with their idea of laws. Now, Kant distinguishes between cases in which reason determines the will and cases in which something else determines the will. Something that in our translation of Kant is described as impulsions, and in some more contemporary translations, the word incentive is used. There's a big interpretive debate over which one is the right one to use, but in any case, our translation says impulsions. Um, so, these impulsions are not reason taking something as a law in the purest way and then guiding action on the basis of that. Kant has sort of an interesting sort of kind of technical terminology for this. What's going on when you actually take something as a law is that the actions that you recognize as objectively necessary are also subjectively necessary. Then Kant says if you just are governed by these impulsions, by these things not coming from reason, then what's objectively necessary, what is driving your action, is subjectively contingent. We'll get into that a little bit later, but just to mark those words for now. What happens when you're acting out of reason is that the laws that are governing you come from your own nature as a rational being itself. On the other hand, when these impulsions from the world apart from reason, when just ordinary stuff in the physical world governs your action, the action is not being driven by your rational nature itself. Instead, it's just being driven by physical laws of the world. Your nature as a rational being isn't what's moving you around and causing you to act. Okay. Now, let's move from this to Kant's discussion of imperatives. There are two kinds of imperatives, Kant says. Imperatives are ought statements that tell you what you ought to do. The two kinds of imperatives are hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperative. So a hypothetical imperative tells you that you ought to do something as a means to something else. For example, if you want to get a good job, do well in school. That's an imperative telling you you ought to try to do well. You ought to try to do well in school? Okay, well, let me just leave that subtly aside. You ought to try to do well in school if you want to get a good job. Well, there's sort of a hypothetical there, if you want to get a good job. And that's what marks these as things that say you ought to do something as a means to something else. If you want something else, then you ought to do this thing as a means. That's how hypothetical imperatives work. They're hypothetical because there's an if there. If you want this, you ought to do that. And that's how they bring in the notion of a means. Well, a means is only something you ought to pursue, or you only ought to do something as a means if you want some further goal, if that further goal is important to you. And that's why the notion of doing something as a means and it's being hypothetical are connected. Because it's only if you want the further goal that you need this thing. That's how means work. A means, something you need just if you want to pursue some further end. Well, you want it if you want the further end. That's why Kant calls these imperatives that tell you to do something as a means to something else hypothetical imperatives. Now, these are distinguished from what Kant calls the categorical imperative. And this applies to all agents, regardless of what their further ends might be. This tells all agents, you ought to do this. Not for any further end. Not just if you want, to get a good job. You ought to do this no matter what. No matter what your further ends are. It doesn't make any specific connection to any further goal that you might or might not have.